importantly, he takes his role as a teacher quite importantly, so I think that you are quite privileged in terms of that. Having said that, let me say something about Israel, which I mentioned to him over lunch today, which I think is very important. When I was a first-year, rather arrogant, first-year political science undergrad student, I had a fight with my lecturer because I couldn't understand why this discipline was called political science and not political studies, because in terms of mathematics or biology or something, you can understand the scientific nature of it. And the argument that he made was the fact that it's a science because you keep a critical distance from your subject matter. You have to approach your subject matter in an emotionally detached manner. Once you start bringing emotions into something like this, what happens is your bias comes up, and we all have bias. Okay? So one of the things in terms of Israel, of course, and I guess I'm very aware of this because of my name, a Muslim first name and a Jewish surname, which means that I'm utterly and totally confused or schizophrenic, is the fact that Israel excites the passions, it excites the emotions, and so I'm going to try to approach it in a way which crosses that particular divide. I should also maybe say to you that Professor Kumaraswamy, on my numerous times coming to JNU, always has this tendency of surprising me. In other words, getting me to do something that I'm no expert on. So let me say up front, I'm no expert on Israeli foreign policy. However, three things. One, I'm a political scientist. Two, I'm from Africa. And three, I work on political Islam. So I am going to be focusing on three aspects in terms of Israel's foreign policy. The first one is the domestic aspect of foreign policy, right? How is foreign policy made? This is absolutely crucial if you want to understand how and why a particular foreign policy is embarked upon, how and why other aspects is softened, other aspects are hardened, and so on. And according to our mutual friend Alon Ben Meir, to understand Israelis' foreign policy, you need to understand its internal dynamics, specifically the fact that it is a fractured democracy. Okay, and that phrase is from Alon Ben Meir. So until 1988, Israel's electoral threshold for you to enter into parliament, to have a seat on the Knesset, was only 1%. And this has increased to 3.25%. But it is still a very low threshold, comparatively speaking. And as a result, you have a plethora of different political parties. Should I also say that you have a plethora of different egos as well. So this kind of makes it impossible for a single party to garner a straight majority, 61 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. And the most recent Israeli election in terms of Netanyahu, Gantz, and so on, emphasizes that point. So there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs taking place at the domestic level, and there's trade-offs taking place at the foreign policy level, and there's trade-offs taking place between the foreign and domestic level, because you need to give something maybe domestically, but it might just harm you internationally, and so on. So you have this plethora of coalition governments, and it has a lot to do, to be honest with you, the personal ambitions of leaders than the national interest. Okay? And it's not unique to Israel. Many countries suffer from that. And therefore, Israeli foreign policy also suffers from these contradictions. Because if you're operating from a realist perspective, you know, it's very simple. It's national interest. Okay, a country knows what its national interest is, it pursues it, and so on. But what happens if you need to give in to a certain constituency and pursue, let's say, a more aggressive foreign policy which might harm you? Because fundamentally, I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu sacrificed his personal career for the sake of Israel, in my view, and that's a personal judgment. Okay? So sometimes politicians think more about electoral support than about foreign policy. and foreign policy, or rather a strategic and coherent foreign policy, is often sacrificed. So how has this electoral politics got to do with Israeli foreign policy? So this is what Alon Ben Meir believes, that Israel's proportional electoral system not only failed to produce a clear winner that can govern with a popular mandate, but in the negotiating process, in terms of the would-be coalition partners, there's hardly any discussion about the major issues that face the nation. There's little or no discussion about the conflict with Palestinians, how to address the Iranian threat, what to do with Hamas, none of that. And to be frank, I think it's a pretty stupid position to be in. And especially in terms of a region as volatile as that. Okay, given the nature of the various threats in the region in terms of Israel, so the current electoral system is not helping. And one suggestion by Alon Ben Meir is that the threshold of representation in the Knesset moves up to 5% to increase stability in Israeli policy, Israeli politics, and specifically in terms of the foreign politics dimension. So that's the one aspect I want to touch on. I want to touch on Israel and Africa because I'm from South Africa. I identify myself as African, despite my love for Indian curries. Okay, so if you go back to the 6-Day War, Guinea-Conakry was the first African country to sever relations with Israel, cut it completely, right? By the Yom Kippur War in 1973, only 3 of sub-Saharan African states maintained ties with Israel. Only 3. 49 years later, almost a half a century later, Guinea-Conakry, which is a Muslim-majority country, was ready to re-establish ties with Israel. And here's the interesting thing. 2016, no fewer than 40 African countries had relations with Israel. And this is set to further grow following Netanyahu's successful trip to Africa in mid-2016. Despite the fact that I don't really like him, I regard him as quite smug and arrogant, the truth is that this was the first by an Israeli prime minister in 30 years. So how did this become possible? How did Israel turn around this isolation on the African continent? Well, this is what the current Kenyan president, Uhuru Kenyatta, said at a joint press conference with Netanyahu. The world has changed. Just because you may wish Israel to disappear doesn't mean to say that it will. Global problems that we now share are different compared to some 30 years ago. And we need to partner with each other. We need to deal with the security threats that we have together. Of course, Kenya, as you know, faces a severe al-Shabaab threat. They have Al-Qaeda also operating on its territory and so on, and they've made common cause with the Israeli Security Service. But you also had the Arab states changing their tune following the Arab Spring. Most importantly, a country like Gaddafi's Libya. Now, Gaddafi's Libya used to bankroll African countries, used to pay their dues to the Organization of African Unity and then the African Union, used to pay their dues to the UN, etc. In return, they had to toe the Libyan line. And following all of these disruptions, these Arab states lost that control over African states, which meant that African countries were free to pursue far more pragmatic approaches in terms of Israel, in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian question, and so on. So Israel's diplomatic offensive comes at the same time as the weakening of this Arab grip. I won't even talk about the changes inside Arab countries because of the Sunni-Shia conflict and so forth. So, and this promise it holds for Israel exists at the economic level and it exists at the political realm. So let's deal with those aspects quickly. So let's deal with the economic. This is what Tomer Havey of the Federation of Israeli Chambers of Commerce said in 2015, trade with African countries made up only 3% of Israel's international trade, and we believe that the potential is far greater and still not materialized. So trading ties is definitely one aspect. Politically, Netanyahu has actually pointed out that whereas in the past the UN voted automatically, the African countries of the UN voted automatically against Israel, the African bloc, which comprises 55 states, traditionally pro-Palestinian in voting in the UN General Assembly, was no longer displaying this antipathy towards Israel, which means that those 55 votes, it's just up in the air now, okay? So you can make overtures to it and so on. However, and it goes to the personality, I think, of Netanyahu here that I made clear of. Netanyahu blotted his copybook when he retaliated against Senegal after it voted with the rest of the UN Security Council to condemn Israeli settlement activity in the West Bank. There seems to be this, if we are in any way hit, including diplomatically, we need to hit harder. And I'm sorry, but I don't buy that because you only make more enemies in the process, in my view. Right? I'm not saying being Jesus and turning the other cheek, but there are far more nuanced approaches. There are far more nuanced approaches of dealing with this issue than attacking Senegal for this. And as a result of this, Daniel Penhasi, who was a former Israeli ambassador to Senegal, so I'm talking about a top Israeli diplomat, actually condemned Netanyahu's actions against Senegal and asking what justified the recall of the ambassador for consultations and the freezing of relations with a friendly Muslim country. EU countries have done that, even American senators, etc., have actually raised this issue as well. African countries, beyond just Africa, it's a strategic link up with Africa. African countries could also serve as launching pads for developing closer relations with other international organizations. Somalia is a case in question, a Sunni Muslim country which also happens to be a member of the Arab League. So, Somalia's President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed and Netanyahu met, and this was unprecedented given the fact that Somalia has never recognized the state of Israel. Okay? Things are changing. So what do African countries get out of this? They also benefit from closer ties with Israel. Israeli medical technology has come to the assistance of Sierra Leone and Liberia, ravaged by the Ebola virus. Ethiopia relies on Israeli expertise to expand its horticultural industry. Ghana seeks Israeli assistance in childhood education. And South Africa seeks to learn more about Israel's water management techniques and growing crops under arid conditions. My country faces a severe drought in several provinces. Kenya, meanwhile, as I mentioned before, seeks Israeli security assistance in fighting terrorism. And here's the rub. This issue, the last issue that I mentioned, security, also is the area where the greatest peril, the greatest danger lies. This security cooperation between Israel and Africa is the area where the greatest danger lies for both Israel and for Africa. What do I mean? The African states are weak. They're constantly fighting each other. There is ethnic conflicts and so on and so forth. So you have the fragility of the African state. You have conflict becoming endemic. And the one thing that I can tell you about Africa is that we do not need more arms. We do not need more arms. And yet, Israeli arms sales to Africa have increased tremendously in recent years. And while it has increased off a low base, and this is nothing compared to what China is doing, what America is doing, what France is doing, what Russia is now doing, etc., it still has a devastating negative impact. One United Nations study found that Israeli arms were serving to fuel the conflict in South Sudan. Security cooperation also holds potential threat for Israel and its international standing. Why? Because the terrorist threat in Africa does not emanate from global jihadism writ large. That develops later. Terrorism begins as local insurgencies fueled by corrupt local elites, driven by real grievances by people against local corrupt elites. And they make use of the terrorist label to secure external security assistance from Western countries, including Israel, to crush dissent against their authoritarian and corrupt rule. So the danger for Israel is that it could be associated with odious regimes with appalling human rights track records. So in my view, and if I had to advise the Israelis, I would say, step out of the security cooperation. Don't do it. It's not good for you. It's not good for Africa. You want to focus on medical assistance. You want to focus on fighting droughts. You want to focus on childhood education. You want to boost trade by all means. Arms? No way. Security training? No way. I want to turn to the third aspect. And this is shifting values in the Arab world. So we did Israeli foreign policy formulation. We did Africa, and this is my final aspect, shifting values in the Arab world. You all know that anti-Israeli and indeed anti-Semitic attitudes has been deeply entrenched in the Arab world. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the spiritual leader of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, said there is no dialogue between them, the Jews, and us, other than in one language, the language of the sword and force. But increasingly, that is becoming a minority viewpoint in the Arab world. There's been processes like urbanization, modernization, globalization, the penetration of modern technology, right? The internet and so on. And surprisingly, that actually holds great promise for Israeli-Arab relations. If you look at the recent World Values Survey and the Arab Barometer, more and more Arabs are becoming more secular, they're becoming more liberal in their attitudes, and they're becoming more egalitarian in their values. They're moving away from religion, they're moving away from tradition, they're moving away from ethnocentrism, and political Islam is declining. I can give you the figures for it, but as seen in the lack of reaction to the death of Morsi, and the absence of religious demands by protesters in Algeria, Sudan, and Iraq. They talk about corruption, they talk about the responsive government, they talk about accountability, they talk about the lack of services. They're not talking about Sharia law. They're not talking about that. You know? And this is very interesting because in Arab Spring 1.0, you know, you had people like Ennahda in Tunisia, you had Muslim Brotherhood, all of these benefiting from the eruptions. No longer is that the case. Arab societies in the process are getting more tolerant of the proverbial other, be it non-Muslims, Americans, Westerners, or indeed Israel. Indeed, this support for Israel, which has been growing over years, has reached unprecedented levels. Because at first the cooperation was in the back room, you know, you don't talk about it. It's now increasingly becoming out there. And of course, what's fueling it is not only these attitudes, but these escalating tensions also between Sunnis and Shiites, seen, for example, in the tensions between Iran and other states. And this forces the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the back burner. Besides, the Arab world tried isolating Israel and tried to go to war with Israel, hasn't worked. So rather not talk about your failures in the process. Now the Arab Youth Survey of 2019, which was conducted in 15 countries in the Gulf, Levant, and North Africa, and involved 3,300 face-to-face interviews, found that 18 to 24-year-olds in the region were becoming more secular in their attitudes. And here's the interesting thing. They're actually blaming religion and sectarianism for the conflict in the region. They are blaming religion and sectarianism in the conflict. You know, in a way, it's kind of weird, but if you look at European history, I mean, you know and I know, the Europeans fought for 300 years, right? Ever since Martin Luther put his 95 Theses on Wittenberg Chapter and started the whole Protestant Reformation. And the funny thing is that if you actually read the classics, the French philosopher Voltaire at the time and so on, they were actually saying, you know, Islam is a tolerant faith. Look, there's no fighting. Look at how the Ottomans are ruling their multi-religious society and so on. So after these years of war and so on, guess what? European countries had this enlightenment, and then came this notion of secularism. Let's push back. Let's keep religion, you know, out of politics, out of government. Let's separate this wall and so on. It seems to me that something is happening here after years of conflict, after years of military movements, and very importantly, let's not forget, you can know, and I say this as a Muslim, you can know the Quran back to front. It doesn't make you a very good water technician to build wells, or a good public administrator, or a good economist, or a good psychologist, or a good president, or anything. It doesn't arm you in that sense. It prepares you for the spiritual world, right? And increasingly, this is the attitude which is coming into being amongst these, amongst the youth of the region. 66% believe that religion is playing too big a role in the Middle East, right? So what's the significance when I'm talking about Israeli foreign policy? It means that Israel is not being viewed from a religious prism. So in future, foreign policies of Arab states can be calculated on national self-interest considerations, not ideological, not emotive, and definitely not religious. Okay? So, it's important. Still talking about these surveys, half of all respondents believe that the Arab world's religious values are holding the Arab world back. In the past, you had these grand conspiracy theories, right? Okay, the West, they are engaged in neo-imperialism. That's what's causing it. You know why the Arab world is poor? Well, it's because the Jewish state is so rich. If you don't believe, read the 12 Protocols of the Elders of Zion, right? You know what I'm talking about. Now, they are looking inward and they're actually blaming themselves, right? Mohammed Sharour from the University of Damascus explains that the region's youth are confronted with a deep intellectual dilemma when it comes to reconciling conservative teachings with the world they inhabit. So they go to a madrasa, they learn these stuff, okay? And now you have this world, this interconnected world, this world of globalization, etc., etc. And you have this massive divide between the have and have-nots and so on. What does the religious text tell you? And let's not forget that when the Islamists were in power in those countries, they did a pretty lousy job in terms of governing. So that doesn't only challenge, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood in their 1 year in power in Egypt, but it also challenges the entire Islamist edifice. Going back to Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, you know, the Khania West of 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini, neither East nor West, Islam is the best. Yes, he was a rapper, true story. Moreover, Sharour states that access to the internet has allowed them to keep pace with worldwide developments, opening their minds to virtually all cultures and civilizations. So they can see what's happening in Chile. They can see the Yellow Vest movement in France. They can see, but people, or the move to impeach Donald Trump, right? They can see people unhappy and people mobilizing. Because fundamentally, if you're a Democrat, you believe there's a social contract. You give a government a vote to rule you, and their part is to keep you safe. Their job is to create the economic opportunities by creating the infrastructure, the educational opportunities for you to move ahead for yourself and for your children, okay? And in the Arab world, this isn't being done. They look at all of these thousands of princes living in their palaces, enjoying this corrupt lifestyle, and they're saying, what about us? And they're blaming themselves. And this has serious implications for Islamist organizations. Polls conducted by BBC News Arabic found that trust in Islamist organizations has fallen massively across the Middle East North Africa region. In Jordan and Morocco, trust in the Muslim Brotherhood dropped by 20%. Hamas support amongst Palestinians, meanwhile, has dropped from 48% to 22% between 2012 and 2019. Okay? Question is, will Israel be able to capitalize on these shifting values in attempting to turn a new chapter with its Arab neighbors? Go back to the domestic constraints. Will they be able to sense this opportunity to do what is right, or will Israeli politicians engage in fracturing Israeli democracy because they're going to win votes at the polls? That's the fundamental question. A lot of the stuff I said to you is actually contained in my new book, right? So please buy it. Support a struggling African scholar. Islamism, Crisis and Democratization. Get it on Amazon. You know, I will autograph it. Thank you very much.
You know, if I have to take a step backwards, if you look at Africa, Africa has certain enormous advantages. 55 countries, a large number of them with the Islamic majority ones. And if you look at the decolonization process, when all the European powers suddenly withdrew from the continent, Israel walked in. And Israel was instrumental in building a number of countries in a variety of world, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of military, in terms of health, social, other issues. But after 67 onwards, you find the Africa withdrew from Israel, which became more intensified after 70s oil crisis and everything. And now, if you look at after 30 years, all these countries are coming back to Israel, not only because of Israel is no longer the untouchable, but the world has changed. And therefore, your priority in 50 was different, decolonization. If you look at it as a student, I know about 20 years ago, when I was a student here, any problem in India, it is colonialism. Everything. From the division of your state, your language, your northeast, any problem for that matter, you blame the British. But you know, it's like me saying, why are you like this? Yeah, my father put me in a Tamil medium school, he didn't give me education, so therefore my writing capacity is bad. Fine. I can say when I was 25 years old. But when I'm 55 years old, I can't blame my father. So I think that is exactly the same. So the global position has changed, the countries have changed, and Africa, if you look at it as a bloc, it's the largest bloc Israel can actually think of. And this is real Israel's challenge is Africa, not Asia. Even though you talk about China, India, Korea and everything, but the real challenge is Africa. But if you look at it, Africa did not get priority in Israel. And the foreign minister's visit, the first one was Moshe Sharett in 1955. And then comes Golda Meir's visit. After Golda Meir's visit, the first foreign ministers to visit Israel was Lieberman. You and I know Lieberman as anti-Arab racist guy. But only when he was a foreign minister, he found time. He simply said, hey, we are ignoring Africa. Let's go. And it is only after that Netanyahu went for the summit meeting. So Africa is a real challenge. And I think if you look at Israeli foreign policy, you have this. And back to the question, the world is changing, Africa is changing, they are looking at Israel as an opportunity in a non-political, non-religious realm. The million-dollar question is what you raise on, are you ready? I think that is a challenge for Israel. Are you ready? But the readiness, you're not ready. How do I know? You don't even agree on who is going to be the Prime Minister for the last almost 1 year. Your priority is, if you look at the question very passingly said, the issue is not, whether I'm going to support you if you increase the settlement, reduces. No. It is not about peace process. Is nobody saying that, okay, my policy is accommodation with the Arabs, your policy is confrontation. We are nowhere near that. The question is, I will get the chair, you will get the chair. So, the realist paradigm we all talk about is simply personalized. The question today is, who will be the Prime Minister? And all the other things become irrelevant. And the next question will be US. Everybody wants to have good relations with the United States. So there is nothing to argue about. I think that is going to be a challenge. The world is changing. The Arab world is changing. Islamic discourse is changing. The youth is changing. The question is, where are you? And I think if you talk to Israelis, to some extent I also feel that you are in the Cold War paradigm. You didn't know that the world has changed. Even today, the Israelis think Europe is more important, United States is more important. And we all know that the economy is changing eastwards. And it is not reflected in the foreign policy priorities. And Africa, the same. Africa has 55 people. If you can actually influence them, you can neutralize anti-Israeli votes in the General Assembly. If you look at that, generally 181 countries supporting you. Only you and probably Marshall Islands and Israel. That once again tells you, what are you doing with the 55 countries African war? I think that is what Professor Solomon is raising it. And if you promise autograph, we'll buy the book. Absolutely. Now, question is, floor is open. Any questions, comments? Anything under the sun? Yes, lady.